So let's talk about this terrible stabbing in Mannheim in southwestern Germany. 5 people are injured. A policeman was killed by an Islamist. The suspect is believed to have come from Afghanistan in 2014. The reaction to it has been, certainly from the German political class, and I think throughout the rest of Europe, to be fair, has been quite muted, alarmingly muted. And this is often the case when there are Islamist attacks, or at least suspected Islamist attacks.
Exactly. I mean, at first it was interesting that there was this reflex to try and generalize what was going on. So even the fact that some of the evidence would point towards a potential Islamist motivation, you've now got the sort of justice minister in Germany now suggesting that that might well be the case. But at first it was very much statements from the chancellor, from the president, saying things to the effect of there's a climate of too much hatred and toxicity in public life at the moment, as if the problem was that too many arguments around the European elections were getting out of hand on social media, and therefore this is the natural consequence of that. A willful ignorance, a attempt to downplay what could quite clearly be the motivation here. And I think particularly this comes in the context of only a few weeks ago now, there was that foiled Islamist attack in Germany, or at least it was being planned to try and basically sort of stab and assault Jewish people. There was also that foiled Hamas-linked attack in Germany back in December, I think, which has kind of been totally forgotten about now. But in Germany, there was these plotters who were apprehended. So this is quite clearly a near and present problem. There's been a lot of talk about the potential terror threat in the run-up to the Euros, the tournament.
And the Paris Olympics as well.
Exactly.
A plot was
it's not
foiled.
like this isn't something which is a real pressing issue, and yet not unlike we've had in our own discussions of Islamist terrorism in the UK, there's just an attempt to try and suggest that it's just a byproduct of the toxicity in public life rather than a very specific political, religious, intolerant threat.
And it's interesting in this case. I mean, there's been almost a defaming of the victims. I mean, the person attacked a rally for a group called Pax Europa, and it's anti-Islamist campaign. And, a lot of the headlines would say stabbing at far-right rally, one of the victims called a xenophobe and an Islamophobe, as if to say they brought it on themselves rather than, being able to look this Islamist problem in the eye.
I mean, I remember almost a similar thing happened with the Charlie Hebdo attacks when in France, when there were some people were saying, well, some of their cartoons were Islamophobic and racist. And I mean, it's really quite sickening stuff. And I think, I really try and think about why is it that the political elite are so uncomfortable and unable to confront such an important issue, that affects everybody in society, that you have what appears to be a sizable and potentially growing number of people that not only dislike their society, loathe it, despise it, and want to cause people serious harm. If there's anything that the state is meant to do, presumably it is to keep us, safe from threats. And this threat is not just a physical threat, it is an ideological threat. Some really shocking statistics. The highest per capita young Muslims relative to their population that went to join Islamic State was Finland. Then Belgium, then Ireland, and then Sweden. These aren't countries that are riddled with hate and racism and marginalization. Actually, these have huge economic and social development and huge opportunities for people. And I think it's such an abdication of responsibility to citizens, but particularly Muslim individuals who want to live free, happy lives, to essentially allow these hardcore ideologues to recruit and get off scot-free when it comes to public debate. And I think that's a real tragedy. And I think it's devastating that the political class continue to refuse to look this in the face.
And I think it's interesting, the countries you've named, none of them are Islamic countries. It's not people from Morocco or Algeria going off to join Islamic State necessarily, or things like that. So to me, that suggests, there needs to be something deeper, a deeper discussion than, often the right-wing response is just, well, let's just deport more people. It's just immigration. We can't have people coming from XYZ country. It's not quite right.
There is a particular form of Muslim identity politics that seems to develop in the West that intersects with a lot of the grievance politics that you see across the board, a lot of the rhetoric, particularly, with within liberal institutions that encourage people to feel ashamed of their society. And there may well be very real alienation about being a minority, in historically, ethnically homogenous societies. And as you mentioned about a lot of Muslim countries, I think there are lots of different ways in these countries to be a Muslim. And actually, oftentimes, that the dominant sense of what it means to be a Muslim is a moderate type. But I think for a lot of young Muslims today, there are seemingly few options, and the most vocal option, which seems to tell young Muslims what it means to be that identity, is a Islamist hardcore option. And I think that is something that needs to be tackled within society.
Tom?
At the same time, I have been struck by the speed with which the migration part of the debate has tried to be shut down in Germany.
Yeah.
So the German Greens going to come out and say anyone who's trying to suggest that we should, tighten up our rules as a consequence of this is, stirring up hate and weaponizing this issue and so on. And politicians of all stripes need to take this question a lot more seriously, because we have had a spate of terrorist attacks across Europe, which have been perpetrated either by migrants or by people who were trying to settle as refugees. We've certainly seen that in the UK with the Hartlepool attack recently, which has kind of been completely forgotten about now. But a guy who was floating around Europe for years and years and years ends up in the UK, again, kind of rejected by all kinds of different countries on the basis that he was seemingly up to no good in his native Morocco, and ends up stabbing a fellow asylum seeker in the northeast of England. Because he was inspired by October the 7th, and this gentleman had converted to Christianity. So there was all these sorts of cases which float up, raise very serious issues about questions of security, of vetting and so on, which really do need to be tackled if we're going to take the Islamist threat seriously. And also if we're going to take some of the heat out of the migration and asylum debate, because as soon as these things feel like they're so lax to the point where even really nefarious individuals who really want to do harm to existing citizenry can exploit them, it's very difficult to get an argument going about why we should be generous in relation to something like asylum or migration or anything else. So the refusal to deal with that piece of the puzzle as well, I think, will only come back to bite a lot of these supposedly more liberal, pro-migration, pro-asylum parties in the long run.
I know that Spiked has a more liberal position. I mean, I'm quite critical about mass migration. But I think, just to Tom's point, I think the inability to have a frank discussion about it is actually producing much more hardline responses, from the right, even in the UK. I mean, even is interesting looking at some of Reform's policies, net zero migration. I think the SDP called for a moratorium. And these actually weren't things we were really hearing. Before 10 years ago, people said, we need to bring it down to the tens of thousands. The pace and scale is too fast and too high. But because we have not been able to have a conversation about it, or at least promises about reducing it have been completely ignored, then I think we are seeing more absolutist positions. And I do think that this is the kind of tragic irony of the political class, that by virtue of refusing to have this important conversation about migration, I think they are actually creating conditions for much more resentment. And I think, I really do worry about that.